Uh, Andy, can you man the laptop? I need to illustrate something
Yeah, what you need
for
to
some
do.
people that
This one here?
I just want to go to the blog and actually, yeah, we're already at the blog. I just want to show them how to find the schedule.
Okay.
I think just scroll up, maybe hit refresh and scroll up, and then if you could just put it, that thing's funky, but for scrolling I use the arrow. Yeah.
I do.
And we're live,
Okay.
okay? And let me see here.
I just turn on the PC.
Okay, and I'll let you watch. I'll have this pointed this way to where you can see the recording, or you can watch for the flashing light. I can keep an eye on it. There we go. Conference, and then, let me see, so that's the blog, right? Okay. No, that's Tank Online. So, Tank blog. Okay. And then there we go. Okay, all right. That's what I'm after. All right, so we're live, okay? And somebody might, when you get a chance, go to Boxcast and make sure we got good sound and everything, and we'll get going here with my second session. Andy will be coming up at 11:30, so we're going to need to fly here on my second session. Somebody emailed me about the schedule, and the schedule is late in coming. But I just posted the next segment of it on paulspassingthoughts.com. So if you go to paulspassingthoughts.com, on the very top of the home page, you have the link for this live session, okay? And the next, if you scroll down, last night's introductory session, my session 1, is the video is there, the transcript is there, which doesn't follow the video exactly because I ad lib a lot, as we all know. So, but at any rate, that's all there, and we're going to be posting more of the schedule by noon. Today will be mostly Andy and I, and then tomorrow will be mostly John Emmel and Susan Dohse. And so I've looked at some of the topics and what people are writing about and really excited about it. If you want to comment on what we're speaking on, as we're speaking on it, email us, shoot us an email, whether it's a question or a comment, mail at tank.online, okay? That's mail at tank.online, TANC.online, okay? We'll get going here. Continuing in my second session on recovering sanctification, and I believe the title of this one is The Folly of Historical Precedent in Regarding the gospel and sanctification in the church, that is historical church precedent, is we have this tension, as we've discussed, between common sense and church orthodoxy, coupled with being comfortable with theological contradiction, is indicative of many well-known church scholars. A lot of Christians don't read their Bible because, frankly, if you don't understand Romans 8:2, Romans chapter 8, verse 2, if you don't understand what's being talked about there, the Bible is going to be utterly and totally confusing to you from beginning to end. Okay, there's going to be lots of contradictions. And you feel free to email us and ask questions about this. But the key to understanding that verse, what you've got to reconcile on Romans 8:2, is that the word for law, both times in that verse, is nomos. Okay? And the word crafter here, Andy, is going to have to correct me if I pronounce anything wrong. I put people in charge of my pronunciation. But I believe it's nomos. Okay? So, both words for law there, okay, is nomos. I've discussed this at length other times about how the church, because of its Gnostic foundations, has to interpret law there as a spiritual laws or law of gravity, okay, and that sort of thing. It's not. The word nomos there is the same word for a moral law, written law, the Word of God, so on and so forth. So you've got two laws there, okay? And you say, well, there's only one Bible. And that's true, okay? But what we often teach is that a true understanding of the new birth tells you that there's two perspectives on the law, okay? And how do I want to word this? The relationship of the law to lost people is totally different than the relationship of the law to saved people who are born again. And it's actually the new birth that changes that relationship of the law to the believer, okay? There's a lot that can be discussed here, but the primary point is that the relationship of the law to the believer who's truly born again, who has literally died with Christ and been resurrected, is a relationship to the law that has no condemnation. No condemnation. Our assurance is founded in the fact that when we stand before God, because Jesus Christ died on the cross, when we stand before God, He will have no law to judge us with. The old us is dead. And in Romans 7, when Paul's going back and forth between the I there that Paul used so often, speaking about himself in Romans 7, he's flipping back and forth between the I, the former I that was dead, and now the present I that is alive. Okay? And that's the only way you can reconcile Paul often saying, well, in that verse, I'm dead, yet I'm alive. But what he's talking about is he's dead to the being under the law, to where there was condemnation. Okay? And I don't mean to get on a rabbit trail here, but this is what's critical about understanding the new birth. Okay? Church, and I'm not going to get into what kind of church, whether Catholic, Protestant, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Advent, it's all progressive justification, okay, in one form or another, okay? So all of these have this in common. There's a single perspective on the law. Law is law, okay? So there's no way for their interpretation of the new birth to have a different relationship to the law. There's a single perspective on the law. Therefore, we still have to be under the law, okay? And their interpretation of being under grace is you receive a double covering from Christ while still being under the law. And as we talked about in the last session, that's impossible. You're either under one or the other. Well, in Protestantism, Catholicism, church, whatever, Jehovah's Witness, whatever it is, Mormon, okay, as a lost person, true, you're only under law. But as a so-called saved person, because they misinterpret the new birth, in other words, they misinterpret the true gospel, now you're under both. Grace is merely an atonement or covering for still being under law. No, you're not still under law. And this is why Christians struggle with assurance of salvation and have to engage in this morbid introspective about what all of their motives are and why am I doing this good act or this love towards the brother. And well, listen, if you properly understand the new birth, it's a fool's errand to be concerned about your motives in doing a loving act for God or someone else, because there's no more law. There's no law to judge you. So the only motive for doing what you're doing is love, because that's all that's left. Okay? That's all that's left. So, any questions, comments, comment?
I have to swallow chocolate first.
We can multitask here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have these conversations with people, with church people,
Mm-hmm.
and when you tell them these things, they think you're crazy.
Right.
Because their first response is, well, that's not what my church believes.
Right.
My pastor doesn't believe that.
Right.
And so, at that point, I'm stuck because it's like, okay, where do you go from there? Because there's so much theological and doctrinal groundwork. I guess I'm saying we didn't come to this point in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say we, I mean like you, myself,
Right.
John, anybody involved with those who comment on the blog. We didn't come to this point in a vacuum. We're at this point after years of trying to figure this out.
All right.
So to approach somebody with this information cold like that,
Right.
you're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
And the reason is, and you've said this before, intellectually people don't believe that.
Right.
When they see and hear words, they take those words at face value. When they hear faith alone means faith alone.
Right.
When they hear finished work of Christ means finished work of Christ.
Right.
So they accept that at face value,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't understand the theological implications behind that, what the orthodoxy really means by
Right.
that.
Right.
And so it's like that's part of the indoctrination process.
Right.
So when you say atonement, they buy into this concept of atonement because in their mind, atonement is what Christ did on the cross, that one time.
Right.
But in the Orthodox view of atonement, that's ongoing.
Right.
And that's what they don't get. And that's where we're at.
Right, and you and I have lived this, because even after you had been part of our ministry for some time, you and I had a conversation on Facebook, and you mentioned the fact of how the blood of Christ covers our sins. And I came back and I said, no, our sins aren't covered. And to be truthful about it, I had just discovered this myself, okay? So I was going to take the opportunity to share it with you. And I said, no, Andy, our sins aren't covered by the blood of Christ. Our sins are ended by the blood of Christ. And you came back and he said, what do you mean our sins are ended? And so unfortunately we were unable to go back and find that back and forth. But what a great piece of information that would be to have, of how you and I worked through that, and the light bulbs started coming on.
But I guess the point is, what I'm trying to make is, there is a disconnect between what people are hearing in church and what they are thinking.
Oh yeah, no doubt about that at all.
And they buy into it,
right.
And so therefore, and therein is the deception, because they're preying on you, assuming that words mean what they mean.
Very few churchians will agree intellectually that you're saved by church membership.
Mm-hmm.
Very few, but then go to church and watch how they function. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, Susan and I had a conversation with a lady. In the same conversation, she denied that you're saved by church membership, okay? But then came right back and said that our very salvation was in question because we weren't presently the member of a church.
Yeah.
It was all in the same conversation, okay? So that's what you're talking about. Anyway, all right, so let's get going on this. I think I can get this in. And in my next two sessions, I'm going to be talking about the history of sanctification in the church. Okay? And what I've entitled this part of it is the folly of historical precedent in regard to the church's view of sanctification's relationship to the gospel. Okay? And here I'm getting into the confusion, well-documented confusion, of well-known mainline scholars. Okay? And nothing illustrates this better than the history of church infighting. Okay? Let me throw in here, not that I'm not on enough rabbit tracks, but Christians absolutely love to debate election and Calvinism and predestination, okay? And they absolutely refuse to repent of that and see the real issue, that Calvin taught a blatant false gospel. All right, it's like debating some secondary. It's like debating some secondary doctrine that the Mormons believe. Hello, why are we even talking about that? Mormonism is clearly a false
It's
gospel.
like debating why women should wear hats in church.
Right.
I think they should wear hats.
So when we speak of common sense, we're referring to being created in the image of God. Now, everyone's created in the image of God. We talked about this last session. And along with the image of God thing is common sense, okay? And so we got to be careful about what kind of gospel we share, that it makes sense, all right? We are referring to what is self-evident. We are referring to the individual's ability to reason, okay? The church, on one hand, will say intellectually that everyone is, even lost people are created in the image of God. But then they'll tell you that the lost person has a total inability to reason, and when you share the gospel with them, if they're going to be saved, it's only because they've been chosen by God at some point, and they're then enlightened. The only thing is, you never hear that in their gospel. When they're sharing the gospel, you never hear them say, "No, I'm going to share the gospel with you. And if God's going to save you, you're going to agree with me. And if God hasn't decided to save you, you're not going to agree with me." So, you never hear that in their presentation, but that's the premise behind it. The scandalous history of the church isn't just shameful for leaving every vestige of decency undisturbed, but for its completely illogical thinking and pure ignorance dressed up in intellectual and scholarly acumen. Church scholars like Dr. Albert Mohler have perfected the academic aurora for purposes of intimidating the laity and self-aggrandizing, complete with reading glasses and bow ties. However, the church's pedigree of logic is a comedy of errors and confusion. As of 1970, it is absolutely clear and well documented that the hallowed halls of Westminster Seminary, a bastion, if not the bastion, of Protestant scholarship, had no earthly idea what Luther and Calvin taught concerning soteriology. This is a documented fact. Okay? In the book that founded this ministry, The Truth About New Calvinism, I document evangelicalism's admission that the church had strayed away from its Reformed roots by everyone who has ever been anyone in the church, such as John MacArthur Jr., except they insinuated that they had known this all along and were then finally sounding the alarm. That's nonsense. Okay? Regardless of incalculable investment of blood, sweat, tears, and hard-earned money by the laity, the who's who of Protestant scholars had no idea what Protestantism even is. Okay? The fact is, an Adventist named Robert Brinsmead, the true father of the New Calvinist movement, came up with a novel idea. Because of all of the tension that had been in the SDA for 100 years about how to do sanctification right, he decided to read the teachings of the Protestant reformers for himself. And Robert Brinsmead, having some crazy high IQ, okay, was able to plow through all of these readings and come up with conclusions. This resulted in a think tank referred to as the Australian Forum, which established the foundation and mode of operation for the New Calvinist movement as we know it today. This thing with the conferences and everything they do was established by the Australian Forum. Okay, it all came out of them. All right. Its theological journal was named Present Truth and was the most widely read theological journal in the Western Hemisphere during the 1970s. Okay? Present Truth was a contemporary explanation of the Calvin Institutes prefaced with the writings of Martin Luther. And that's how I came to understand the Calvin Institutes. I read Present Truth first, which was Robert Brinsmead and the other three that made up the core four of the Australian Forum who published Present Truth. I did a lot of reading in Present Truth in those articles, that journal, and that enabled me to understand what was going on in the Calvin Institutes and a lot of Luther's writings as well. all right? Though swept under the rug by the church, it is the most significant document coming out of the church since the founding documents of Protestantism or the early councils of the truth on the church. And that's true. Present Truth magazine, okay, can be found online, okay, Google it, and you can read it for yourself. That is the most significant church document, okay, to ever come out of the church since the founding documents, because what it did, it enabled contemporary churchians to actually understand Protestant soteriology, in which the New Calvinist movement is founded on today. And all of the controversy caused by the New Calvinist movement in today's church is solely based on the fact that until New Calvinism comes along, Protestants didn't understand what Protestantism was. They had no clue what Calvin or Luther really taught. Okay, complete with pictorial illustrations, it focused and revealed the church's contemporary heresy in conjunction with true Protestant orthodoxy. The separation of justification and sanctification, and the idea that justification, salvation, is a finished work and the believer, and sanctification is a separate process. The belief about that in the church contemporarily was absolute heresy to Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, Spurgeon. That idea was complete heresy to them. Okay? The journal called Sanctification, Justification in Motion. It refuted a new birth as a false gospel. They wrote an article that was one of their biggest articles in Present Truth that was also endorsed by Michael Horton and others. And the title of the article, written by Graham Goldsworthy, was this. And before I'm done, remind me, I'll get a screenshot of it and put it up here. I'll put the screenshot of the article up here. But the title of the article was, and I quote, "The False Gospel of the New Birth." The False Gospel of the New Birth. Okay? And that particular article was written by Graham Goldsworthy. Well, Graham Goldsworthy was invited to Southern Seminary in 2009, okay, by Al Mohler to do a series of lectures on the Reformation. Okay? I'm just saying here. Okay? Just saying. All right? It refuted the new birth as a false gospel and rejected once saved, always saved, and it also emphasized salvation by church attendance and membership is the only means to partake in the justification process.
Oh,
Okay?
look up there.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, so there it is, Present Truth, Volume 37, Article 4, The False Gospel of the New Birth. Now, that was written, I correct myself, that was written by Jeffrey Paxson, okay? But if you go all the way down, okay, or I'm sorry, there's another article in Present Truth that Graham Goldsworthy wrote, in which he cites this particular article, okay? And Jeffrey Paxton was one of the core four of the Australian Forum, okay? Him and Jeffrey Paxton, at the very least, you've got one member of the core four, Graham Goldsworthy, being invited to Southern Seminary in 2009 to lecture on the Reformation, with a follow-up article by John Piper, on his Desiring God website, praising the accuracy and of Goldworthy's lectures at Southern. Okay, and I include chapter 4. I talk about John Piper's endorsement of Graham Goldsworthy's lectures at Southern Seminary, in which Graham Goldsworthy said that the very cause of the Reformation was the Catholic Church leaning towards this idea that the righteousness of God was infused into the believer due to the new birth. Okay? And Luther and Calvin refuted that. Okay? So, the seed of God that the Apostle John clearly says is in us is the seed of God in us, but anyway, you do the math, it doesn't add up. Okay? It did this because that's Protestantism. Okay, that is Protestantism. The church got woke by what eventually ended up being the New Calvinist movement. Protestant scholars, okay, can somebody re-hit the local for me? Thank you. That's good. Protestant scholars had no idea what a Protestant is. Hail to the professional clergy. Okay, look, John MacArthur, it's documented. John MacArthur Jr., all of these people, they had no clue what Protestant soteriology really was. Okay, they had to be reintroduced to what it really was by a Seventh-day Adventist. And that's in its documented church history. Okay? And John MacArthur Jr. really passed on an opportunity to change church history dramatically. He was confronted with a choice. Go with figuring out for himself what the Bible was really saying, or the traditions of Luther and Calvin. He chose the traditions of men. Okay? But you know, I don't think he would have lost what he thought he was going to lose. I think that, you know, if he would have stood up and loved the truth enough to say, hey, we've had it wrong, okay, because what's just been revealed to me about what these guys really believed is not the Bible, okay? He didn't do that. He chose the traditions of men, okay? So, like most expertism, it's a pipe dream. Hence, the ministry has documented the wars between those who found out what Protestantism really is, because an Adventist decided to actually read their writings and everyone else proclaiming Protestantism who had no idea what it is, which is most. Please note, anyone saved in the church since its conception in the 4th century is saved by their intuitive gospel knowledge and confusion regarding church orthodoxy. Okay? What good that has ever come out of the church is due to its confusion regarding what the reformers really taught about sanctification. And there was a period in church history where the church did do a lot of good because it was confused enough. Okay? When the church does understand what the reformers really taught, nothing but darkness and death and bloodshed ensues, and tyranny. This confusion resulted in at least an anemic sanctification, which is better than none. So the confusion, and as I've said before, there's two major things that confused Protestant orthodoxy, okay? And that is the American Revolution and its emphasis on individualism and freedom, and people getting access to the Bible. Okay? Thank goodness. Well, and because of their grammatical reading and understanding of the Bible, you've got this contradiction in what church orthodoxy really is and what people read in their Bible, and then Americanism. All right? Now, there's a reason the New Calvinist movement hates America and Americanism and makes the American dream something where, where all it is a bunch of evil, greedy capitalism and selfism. Okay, there's a reason for that. Because they know that the American Revolution actually had a big hand in getting true Protestantism off the track. Okay? So you've got this confusion, and what entered in is this anemic sanctification. Before the American Revolution, and before many Christians had free access to the Bible, and the Reformation gets credit for the printing of Bibles and free access to the Scriptures and making it available in the English and this, that, and the other. Foundationally, that was never the intent of Protestantism. Luther or Calvin, either one, was certainly not in favor of the Scriptures being available to the people en masse. Okay? There were a few confused souls in the Reformation that made that happen, and thank goodness for them. Okay? But it caused confusion. Okay? So what comes out of this is this anemic sanctification. All right? And then the New Calvinist movement comes along and blames the anemic sanctification for where the church presently was, and goes back to, the original doctrine of the Protestant Reformation was like, further killing somebody that's already dead, if that's possible. Yeah, Andy.
They do that under the guise of legalism.
Right.
Because you talk about this weak sanctification.
Right.
What you've got is, you've got people in church who realize that if you're a Christian, there's supposed to be something different about you. You're supposed to be behaving differently. You're supposed to be looking differently, acting differently, not being like the world, which is really what sanctification is all about. Is being distinct from... Being distinct so that you are recognized as God's peculiar people.
Right.
Okay? So then you've got a bunch of confused Christians who are confused enough to at least know they should be different.
Right.
And then they're going around looking at Christian people who call themselves Christians who aren't acting any differently and are, for lack of a better, not ridiculing them, but admonishing them and exhorting them to, hey, you're a Christian, you should be acting this way. And now you get the New Calvinists to step in and they come, oh, well, you're just being a legalist.
Right. Moralism.
You're trying to be a legalist. Right. You're trying to earn your sanctification by being righteous.
Because you're still under law.
Yeah. You're just trying to earn your righteousness by keeping some standard of law that you can't keep.
Right.
And so this is where that pushback is coming.
Right.
Which I could never understand.
Right.
8 years ago, when this was all coming into our church, I understood this perfectly. But then, all of a sudden, when you start being ridiculed because you're trying to behave like a Christian, and you expect the same from others who say they are, now all of a sudden I'm being labeled a legalist?
Right.
What's up with that?
Because what they're saying is, oh, you think we should try our best to keep the law? Yeah. Okay. Would did you keep the law perfectly today? Well, no. Well, then all bets are off. You know, James 2:10. See, and they throw James 2:10 in your face because everything's interpreted through the prism of justification. Every verse in the Bible, the official hermeneutic of the Protestant Reformation is that every single verse in the Bible is about justification. Everything is interpreted through justification. Okay? So, did you keep the law perfectly today? Well, no, I'm sure I didn't. Well, then you're guilty of violating the whole law. James 2:10.
And that's not the point.
Right, and that's not, of course that's not the point of
That's
James
like,
2:10.
and that's as you say, that
Right.
is under law thinking. Anybody who asks that
Under law
question,
thinking.
anybody who asks that question is thinking like an under law person, and
So,
not an under grace person.
on top of what you just shared, couple that with the fact that that well-meaning, confused Christians who are saved because of their intuitive knowledge of the new birth, okay, and that it is a true transformation, okay, but couple that with the fact that they still have the church's single perspective on the law, which makes it absolutely impossible to know what your motives are.
Right.
Now, because there's only one law, and it's the standard of justification, why am I really doing this? Is this self-justification? You have no way of knowing, because the law's still there. And you're justified by the law. It's justification by the law. You know, and they would be quick to say, a new Calvinist would be quick to say, read Luther and Calvin. They'll tell you that it's impossible for you to do a good act in obedience to the law without self-justification. Okay? This is where it's key to understand that we're not justified by the law, and the law is not the standard of justification. The new birth is the standard.
It also perfectly explains why Luther wanted to throw the book of James out of the Bible.
Right, yes. Okay. So, the Reformers rejected the new birth as a righteous state of being and reinterpreted the biblical new birth. Therefore, and they play games with this until you do what I did with Dr. James White on the radio and said to him point blank, as Christians, are we only declared righteous, or are we righteous as a state of being? Dead silence. Well, and then he gets into this. That depends on whether you're talking about justification. No. You're not gonna. You're not gonna get me into the word shell game between justification and sanctification. No. Are we only declared righteous? Okay. Or are we righteous as a state of being? Okay. And he wouldn't answer the question. Okay. Now, you take guys like Jay Adams. They'll say, on the one hand, Jay Adams will say, well, of course we're righteous as a state of being. But then, you know what he'll say on the other hand? He'll describe justification in the traditional Protestant language of being, get this, a legal declaration. Huh?
Forensic.
Or forensic declaration. A, it's legal. B, it's only a declaration. Well, how's that a righteousness apart from the law? So I'm justified apart from the law, but justification is a legal declaration? Really?
And the
Okay.
real heresy to that comes out when you have men like R.C. Sproul stand up and apply that same standard to Jesus himself. That
Right.
What he's effectively saying is Jesus' righteousness was a legal declaration.
Well,
Jesus was righteous by some legal standard.
R.C. Sproul actually gets away with stating that Jesus obtained his righteousness that is now imputed to us by coming and keeping the law perfectly. So
Yeah.
Jesus was not righteous as a state of being when he came into the world. He had to keep the law perfectly to earn his righteousness. In other words, he wasn't righteous by virtue of who he was. He had to earn it through perfect law keeping. He actually gets away with saying that. And Susan and I confront, what's his name? Atuan BB, they call him BB for short. We confronted him with that at the Cross, 16 conference, and he's like, yeah, that's right, I agree with that statement. And we're like, okay then, all right. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that Christians know anything about sanctification or Christian living, okay? Because of the fact that in church, there never has been any sanctification. It's all been about justification. We can conclude unequivocally that Christians really don't know anything about sanctification or Christian living. And if you go to church or read the newspapers, it's fairly evident, right? Okay? Susan and I went to a concert where Mark Hall, the lead singer of Casting Crowns, even admitted it and stood in front of everybody there and said that as Christians we're nothing but train wrecks. Okay? So, that would seem to indicate that we don't know much about Christian living if we're train wrecks. Okay? Church has never been about sanctification, therefore sanctification must be recovered. And as we will see, this will only be accomplished by the laity. Please stop looking for some educated teacher that will reveal these things to you. Please stop being a lazy thinker. Rather than study these things for yourself, you turn yourself into a pretzel, Googling like a lazy person who works harder to get out of working than the work himself. Have you ever noticed that about lazy people? They work harder at getting out of work than the work itself. Okay? Please just stop it. You are the teacher. Nothing gags me more than churchians who claim to be Bereans. That's a joke. Real Bereans teach others with what they have discovered in the Bible through their own reason, study, and research. A Berean isn't someone who thinks other people's thoughts because the other people were taught by Protestants who didn't even know what Protestantism is until 1970, and this Adventist theologian came along and saved the day. It's a joke. Point in case, and I am just being honest here, if you email me and say, as many people have, hey dude, I stumbled across this guy on the internet and he seems to get it. Here's the link. Alright? I'm probably not going to read it. Okay? In fact, I'll just go ahead and be honest. I ain't going to read it. Okay? I'm not going to the link. I'm not reading it. Okay? However, if you email me and say, hey dude, I was reading such and such in the Bible and the following idea occurred to me, I'm probably all ears. Okay? Andy's original perspective and on ecclesia and women speaking in the church is an example of what really trips my trigger. Not the regurgitating of church confusion. A rose by any other name is still a rose, and the same goes for a septic tank in disrepair. Okay? Now, I'm not going to get into the second part of my second session, okay, where I discuss the contemporary church wars between the old Calvinist and the new Calvinist, which, by the way, I was right in the middle of for a couple of years, okay? But the reason in my next session I want to talk about the contemporary church wars between old Calvinists and new Calvinists is nothing illustrates better than the fact that the top dog, big cheese theologians of the 80s, or the ages rather, were completely confused about what Protestantism is. Okay? And with that, I'm going to wrap up, and Andy will be on with his first session at 11:30. Any questions or comments to add to that? Well, then we'll wrap up, and if somebody wants to turn off the recorder and the live link, we'll be good to go. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Is there anything else I need to stop?
No, I think we're good.
I'll go get the Wi-Fi.
Did Susan's then?
No, I just put it there. She walked away. What did I say there? Nothing too.
Yeah, I need to go 3-hole punch that.
Okay.
It might not make sense at all, it's just
Not complete thoughts, just kind of ideas that I want to. When there's things I want to specifically say, I'll write them down exactly the way I want to say them and just kind of read from my script. But most of the time, I just kind of want to just get the idea, get the thought, and then just kind of elaborate on it.